Just think about it for a second. One of the world's two superpowers, an empire that stretched across 11 time zones, just disappeared, gone from the map. Not in some epic war, but in a chain of events that seemed to happen almost overnight. So how did the mighty Soviet Union, this nuclear-armed giant, collapse so fast?
Hey everyone, welcome to the Untold Facts. This is where we break down huge, complex historical events into something you can really wrap your head around. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest stories of the 20th century. If you get something out of this deep dive, do me a favor and hit that like button, share it, and of course, subscribe. All right, let's jump right in.
So let's start with this quote because it just perfectly captures the whole story. Back in 1959, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev famously told Vice President Richard Nixon, "Your grandchildren will live under communism." Nixon fired right back, saying, "No, Khrushchev's grandchildren will live in freedom." And as you can see from this quote years later, Nixon was right in a way that I don't think anyone, even him, could have truly imagined.
And yeah, that's the big question here, isn't it? How does that happen? This wasn't some military defeat on a battlefield, it was a total implosion. To really get it, we need to look at the three big pieces. The deep, deep cracks in the foundation, the one man who tried to patch things up, and all the pressure from the outside that finally brought the whole thing down.
Okay, Section 1, Gorbachevs Gamble, or as we're calling it, the spark that lit the fuse.
Right at the center of this whole storm was Mikhail Gorbachev. Now you gotta understand, he wasn't trying to destroy the system, he was a true believer who thought he could save it. His big ideas were these two policies, glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring. The plan was basically to open the windows a little bit, let in some fresh air, and get the rusty old machine running again. What he didn't count on was that when you open the windows on a house that's secretly rotten to the core, the wind doesn't just freshen the place up, it blows the whole thing down. His policies didn't cause the collapse, but man, they put it on fast forward.
Which brings us right to Section 2, a rotten foundation, looking at the cracks that were already deep inside the empire.
So if Gorbachev's reforms were the spark, what was the powder keg? Well, it all starts with the economy. The Soviet Union ran on what's called a centralized command system. Try to imagine this. A handful of planners sitting in an office in Moscow trying to decide everything for hundreds of millions of people. And I mean everything. They were setting prices and production quotas for almost 24 million different products. It's an impossible task.
And the result for everyday people? A total disaster. You had constant shortages of basic things like soap or shoes. And think about it, why would you work harder or come up with a better idea when all that mattered was hitting a quota set by some bureaucrat? It created this huge black market or informal economy called blat, which was all about using connections and trading favors just to get by. The official system was basically a joke.
This whole thing led to a totally bizarre economic situation. You know how normally when you make more of something, the cost per item goes down? That's called economies of scale. Well, the Soviet system was so unbelievably inefficient that it created the total opposite, a diseconomy of scale. They were so obsessed with quantity, not quality, that making more stuff actually made things more expensive and created mountains of waste. The system was literally fighting itself.
So, where was all the wealth and energy of the country going? Well, it was the classic guns versus butter problem. The Soviet Union was locked in this incredibly expensive arms race with the United States. They were pouring a massive chunk of their entire economy into the military, the guns, which meant there was almost nothing left for the butter. You know, stuff like decent food, housing, and consumer goods that people actually needed.
But the cracks weren't just economic, they were cultural, right in the soul of the empire. We're taught to think of the USSR as a union of equals, but a lot of historians now see it through this lens of coloniality. That's the idea that even when a formal empire is gone, the old power structures, the old ways of thinking, and the old resentments, they all stick around.
And this created this really weird, conflicted identity. Some scholars even call it a schizophrenic empire. On the one hand, Russia had this deep-seated inferiority complex about the West. But on the other hand, it acted just like a colonial power, bossing around and dominating all the different peoples in places like the Caucasus and Central Asia. That kind of hypocrisy breeds a lot of anger, just waiting for a chance to explode.
All right, so the whole structure is rotting from the inside. Now for Section 3, the American pressure cooker, the big push from the outside.
While the Soviet Union was struggling internally, it was also getting squeezed externally, especially by the United States under President Reagan. His strategy was really a tale of two halves. In his first term, it was all confrontation, calling the USSR an evil empire, launching a huge military buildup, and proposing the Star Wars missile defense plan, which the Soviets knew they couldn't possibly afford to compete with. But then, in his second term, the tone shifted completely to cooperation. Reagan and Gorbachev started meeting, signing major arms reduction treaties. It was a whole new ballgame.
But the American pressure wasn't just military, it was cultural, and maybe even more powerful. Thanks to Gorbachev's own policy of glasnost, Soviet officials could suddenly travel to the West. Can you imagine their shock walking into an average American supermarket for the first time? Just seeing the sheer abundance, the choice, the quality of food available to regular people, it completely shattered their belief that their system was working. They called it the supermarket shock, and it was a kind of psychological defeat that no missile could ever deliver.
So you have a rotten foundation and you have intense pressure from the outside. That brings us to Section 4, the final unraveling, when everything started to fall apart at once.
And when the end came, it came with stunning speed. In '86, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster just blew the lid off the government's incompetence and secrecy. By '89, you had these incredible independence movements like the Baltic Way, 2 million people linking hands across 3 countries to demand freedom. Then, the final dominoes fell in 1991. Communist hardliners tried to stage a coup against Gorbachev, and when it failed, the party's power was just gone. A few months later, on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin. The USSR was officially over.
Section 5, a world transformed. Because when an empire that big disappears, the story doesn't just end. What was the aftermath? What was the legacy? Well, the collapse didn't exactly create a fresh start. The 15 new countries that rose from the ashes were stuck with these toxic colonial legacies. They inherited sham constitutions that didn't actually limit the government's power, political systems with all the power concentrated in one super president, and this deep cultural distrust of laws and courts. Throw in complete economic chaos, and you've got a recipe for a very, very difficult transition to democracy. And that leaves us with one last really important question to think about. The name is gone, the flag is in a museum, the statues are down. But have the old ways of thinking, that imperial logic of a powerful center controlling everyone else, has that really disappeared from the region? I think that's a question history is still trying to answer.
And that's our look at the perfect storm that brought down a superpower. If this explainer helped you make sense of it all, please share it with someone else who's curious. And of course, make sure you're subscribed to the Untold Facts for more deep dives into the stories that really shaped our world. Thanks so much for watching.